It is very exciting to have our graduate student to present. And before we start, I talk to a couple of you, and this probably is the first time we have graduate student to present in front of the peers. Our first speaker today is Matthew Howe, and he worked with Dr. Eames before, and Dr. Eames was here at UAG, that was before my time. So please join me, welcome Matthew for his presentation.
Thank you. So I'm going to be going over EEG activity and some novel methods we use to classify out bursts and relate them to an event called hypoxia. Many of y'all might not be familiar with hypoxia. It is a brain response to lower levels of oxygen. Your brain is a very costly metabolic function, using about 20% of all of the oxygen coming in to your body. And if you think about the electron transport chain, you might be familiar with in the mitochondria, producing ATP for use regulating our ionic transport in our neurons. A large portion of this is the oxygen coming in and allowing that conversion of ADP back into ATP. So in monitoring this, we want to look into how oxygen affects the brain, and we can see on the neuron here, when our oxygen levels deplete, our ATP, of course, isn't able to produce as easily, and we get a widespread hyperpolarization across the brain. For the action potential on the neuron itself, you're going to need the ability to increase the polarization, but with lower levels of ATP, we're not able to monitor this, and we get a widespread depolarization affecting very highly metabolic active brain regions, for example, the thalamus and some of the inner brain regions, as well as in the neocortex, especially in the frontal and parietal and occipital regions, which is where you'll see some activity later in the talk. The reason we look into hypoxia is due to my work with the Department of Defense. Here you can see I have an F-35 pictured, and the government is very, looks a lot into how their money, of course, is being spent and where risk occurs, particularly in high-speed aircraft like the F-35 and other flight jets. A lot of lives were lost over the last few years, and a lot of money spent in accidents. We call these physiological episodes, from things like hypoxia, like I'm talking about today, to spatial disorientation. These jets are running much faster than your typical Boeing 747s that y'all might have flown in previously. These are running around 500 to 600 miles per hour, versus these jets running at 12 to 1400 miles per hour, so more than the speed of sound. But the main issue here is actually their climb speed. So if you think about a 747, it takes about 20 to 25 minutes to get to cruising altitude at around 10,000 plus feet, up to 30,000. Here we're doing that at 30 to 40 times as fast, up to about a minute it takes to reach those high speed, or that high altitude. And in this, of course, you have very intense flight for the pilot. So any kind of risk to dizziness, visual coordination, or other reaction time things are very dangerous for the pilot, especially if they lose consciousness. Of course, then you can't fly the plane. So with hypoxia, you start to get these types of symptoms coming in, of visual and auditory hallucination, or issues with their mental fatigue. So in hypoxia, this has been studied for a long time. The EEG being created around the 1920s, Berger even looked into, the creator of the EEG, looked into breathing into paper bags and starting to see changes in the signals. But we started to see more epileptic activity coming in with this study where they used felines and closed their carotid and vertebral arteries, and basically limiting all blood flow to the brain, causing anoxia, which is a form of hypoxia. And then later in the 60s, we were able to see these kind of bursting activities appear during oxygen being balanced with nitrogen, so much lower levels of breathing oxygen than what we're used to in our air today. In more recent studies, they looked into band power changes, such as the delta and alpha band changes here. Here I have the alpha band power. You can see it increasing throughout hypoxia. These are coming from those bursts you were seeing on the previous slide, increasing the overall magnitude and power of the signal. But these kinds of results have been very inconsistent across other studies. Like you can see, sorry, we couldn't point on the same side. Like you can see here, although we see increases in alpha in some studies, not all of them have increases in alpha, and power in general has been shown to be inconsistent across these. Although the delta power almost always seems to increase in these studies. So the slow wave activity increasing during hypoxia. And you might be thinking, why can a signal burst more during a state of stress? This is seen as kind of a protective signal, particularly burst suppression, which is related in other things like epilepsy and like hypothermia, like I have pictured here. Burst suppression is seen as a protective signal that comes likely from the thalamus. So if you think about these slow delta waves appearing, and you can see the bursts increasing over the time course here, these are suppressing parts of the brain, lowering activity, and we start to get a signal that looks more and more similar across the brain, or a decrease in entropy over time. So you can see when hypoxia appears, we have a much lower overall signal change. Think about the brain as this very static image. The static is decreasing and you get more of a synchronous wave going across with the delta activity. This neuronal isolation from the widespread depolarization is keeping those smaller groups of neurons from firing while the overall pattern of the brain is kept. So in my study, we hooked participants up to an oxygen device that balanced with nitrogen and had them perform a few cognitive tasks in a loop. These cognitive tasks were chosen because they represent things that would be going on during a flight, such as tracking objects as they come around the screen. And then during these tasks, we, over 5-minute periods, lowered the oxygen levels down to about 25,000 feet simulated altitude. This was a pretty intensive process. You can see in the last 2 exposures here, participants started to drop out or asked to stop the study. We were monitoring them in case they stopped responding to the cognitive tasks or taking too long to respond, and asked them to stop. And we even had 2 participants lose consciousness during the study. So looking into the data here, we can see that their reported symptoms increased a lot during the hypoxic state on the top, the symptoms being these little blips. However, this is inconsistent across participants. You can't just say, oh, I recognize that I'm hypoxic, as well as some people are more resistant to hypoxia than others. We also looked into their SpO2 and their BPM, or their heart rate, and you can see the SpO2 dropping across each exposure and going up in heart rate. And then also we looked into their accuracy and time to complete those sets of cognitive tasks, for their accuracy dropping down and the set time of completing all 4 levels increasing over the last 2. For the increase in SpO2, you might be saying, okay, why can't we just use SpO2 to monitor for hypoxia? It's what's been done previously. This is a consistent curve, and we might not be able to tell when the person is reaching mental fatigue states or when they're about to drop out from the SpO2. Some people might drop out at a certain, like 80% blood oxygen versus others at around 60. So we looked into their EEG activity, and you can see an increase near the end of the hypoxic state. And if we make that more of a relative baseline relative power, you can see we start to get these 3 subbands appearing. Particularly, we used wider subbands than what's usually used in EEG, because we notice also a drift of the signal towards lower and lower power. So we ended up choosing these 3 subbands and looking into bursts within them. Instead of using power like previous studies, which can be costly and have a lot of artifacts, this kind of analysis, you have to do a lot of post-processing, choosing noisy channels, and making sure that the data quality is good, or else you might see, like in exposure 3, not all of them were significant, versus here, once we do all of the supervised rejection, they were significant. We wanted something that could be done in real time for better classification. So we looked into these bursts, like you can see in the normoxic or the sham condition at the top here. We start to have these bursts appearing at the end, just like was seen on very old, much older studies. And we looked into detecting these bursts and looking at their duration, the rate of how many bursts per minute, and also the number of channels that had overlapping bursts detected. We were able to detect these bursts through amplitude threshold detector, and you can see once we pass the secondary threshold there, we start to look around this burst and see if it crosses enough in oscillatory activity, that second burst, and then we can capture surrounding areas based on merging other areas where we cross that second threshold, and then detect said burst. We're also able to reject things that like eye motion or eye blink artifacts based on a third threshold, like you can see here, where we immediately reject the surrounding area, or if there's not enough oscillatory nature of the burst. So from this, we're able to take our 1 to 24 hertz EEG data and detect out bursts in these 3 subbands, and then also reject things that look like artifacts are not necessarily part of the hypoxic data. From this, we were able to see a sharp increase in our burst features of the rate, the duration, and the channels bursting in all of our subbands. You can see temporally there's a bit of a difference in the lowest subband in blue there. In the last exposure, a much sharper increase, where in the other 2, it's more of a gradual change. And then we even looked at aligning to the end of when the participants dropped out. And you can see that it was a much more stable curve there, showing that as the participants are about to drop out, their burst features really increase, and then they might faint or just stop responding, become dizzy to the task. We were even able to get some spatial specificity in these. So in normoxia, you can see not too much change going on. I'm showing the rate here across each channel. And then in that last exposure level, you can see 2 hot spots, particularly a frontal and parietal, like I was saying, these metabolically active brain areas in our lowest subband, and then in our other subbands, a gradual change in areas that we saw active during the sham condition, like in our 5 to 15 hertz and 13 to 24 hertz subbands. Finally, we looked into correlating these features to our physiological and behavioral aspects. Here you can see in the SpO2, and then across our each participant, we saw a overall increase as the SpO2 decreased, so a negative correlation there, and then a positive correlation to the heart rate increasing with our features. And then we were able to see it very similar with accuracy. A negative correlation as accuracy decreases, an increase in the burst features, and time to complete an increase with longer and longer task time. We were able to, what I have pictured here is just the highest correlation in each, but you can see it was pretty stable across all of our features, not just the ones I have pictured there. With that, I wanted to show where other areas where this could be used, this burst detection, loss of consciousness research, or in comatose or other like anesthetic states. We see these burst suppression activity occurring, so we could also do burst detection there, as well as in sleep stage analysis. As you start to fall asleep, you start to get these delta wave bursts coming in, and even in vigilance-based tasks, so these mental fatigue tasks, you start to get alpha or theta band bursting as the brain is trying to conserve or go into a sleep state. This could also be used in a device that recognizes mental fatigue or long-term fatigue in like survey aviation, where they're flying for 3+ hours at a time, or even in machinery, construction, or long-term operation of vehicles. With that, I want to thank my lab mates for all of the help in my research, and go to any questions, as well as my references if y'all would like to take any pictures, but yeah.
We have time for questions. Any questions from the audience?
Sure.
Thank you for the nice presentation. Actually, I have one. Do you have any limitations for the study?
Yes, so the, like I was talking about with the hypothermia, again, the bursts are not necessarily specific to hypoxia, so they can occur in other stressors, like in hypothermia I have mentioned here, as well as hypoxia is different person to person. So these bursts occur after a good 10 minutes of the hypoxic state. So what we want to look into in further studies is rapid onset hypoxia and seeing if we can still get the bursts, as well as in recovery periods like you see pictured here, where they've seen some activity, but we don't know if the bursts are necessarily staying around.
One more thing. Actually, the problem you are actually addressing is with the swift maneuvers in the aircraft movement, right?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
The problem which you were addressing is in the defense sector, where there is swift maneuvers in the aircraft. And the pilots are exposed to such G effects. Actually, what is happening physiologically is the brain is deprived of the entire blood, not only oxygen. So there was a study which you have shown in the previous slides where cats are being studied and they have simulated with the entire blood supply to the brain is stopped. So in your case, are you taking care of such any such thing, or only you are focusing on the oxygen aspect?
So I have some other research. I can't really talk about it with the DoD, but yeah, we're looking into other things that happen during flight. The G-forces pulling the blood out is not as much a concern in this study, because hypoxia is not necessarily happening during the very takeoff, but rather if the device, like the mask supplying the oxygen, fails, or we've even had some pilots will sneak up a sandwich and then take off the mask and eat the sandwich, and then they're suddenly hypoxic because they're at 40,000 feet. So yeah, looking into more of these things that are not necessarily happening during a change in G-force, that's a different area that I work on, but yeah. Any other questions at all? Great.
No other questions? Please join me and, oh, go ahead, sorry.
So, could the task you assign to the participant really matter in terms of the order of tasks? And do you see any sort of cognitive impact?
So for this, the paper that I'm presenting today, we didn't go too much into each task individually, but you can see that they're doing like a Stroop-based task here. I don't know, maybe you can't, and then a tracking task. These were a lot harder than the other ones. So the accuracy was kind of saturated in the easier tasks. That's why we started using that time to complete metric. I would have liked to have randomized the tasks, but I didn't have the study design, so yeah. But there is, we also noticed the bursts were more correlated during the harder tasks.
Any other questions? Okay, please join me and my